Well, greetings. Welcome to this, the first of our sessions of our class on church history. While it is our first class on church history, this is the third video that I've made and hopefully will be posting online, the first two being worship services. And I guess I hope that when you were watching these things, you were able to tell that I was not very happy with the quality of those productions. Not that I hope I acted unhappy with it, but I was unhappy with it, as maybe you were unhappy with it. There were things about them that I wish I could have changed and things that I wish I could change still. The reality is that I'm doing these things alone, and that means that I have to be someone who's able to do lighting and sound and AV, and I'm none of those people. I don't know how to do any of those things, and so I'm learning how to do everything a step at a time, failing, trying over. And as a matter of fact, everything that I'm doing is a work in progress, and that includes this session. As a matter of fact, this is the second time I've done this today. The first time, I really don't think I did anything wrong, but it was a matter of uploading it to YouTube, and something happened in the upload, and it simply wasn't there anymore. And so here I am doing it again, which is fine. It'll be another learning experience, and I certainly hope that that this will be online before too long. Of course, I don't need to say that, because if you're watching it, you are watching it online and you know that it worked. One of the things that I have been most concerned about and heard comments about, although really no one actually complained, comments that the audio was not good and it was hard to hear. So I've done my best to improve that, and this time I'm trying to improve it simply by the use of these things, my speakers. So in other words, I'm trying to improve the audio simply by improving the volume. Volume, of course, hopefully makes a difference. And so we'll see if the audio is better in this production than it was in the other two productions. Okay, well, let's try to get started. As I said, this is our first session on church history, and I want it to be known that this is going to be somewhat more formal than what the other two sessions that I've done, meaning worship services. That's why I'm sitting down. Don't want to look too much like I'm preaching. I was afraid that maybe I did during the first take of this earlier in the day. So anyway, another change that I made was that I also did have a whiteboard in here, and thought I could jot things down on the whiteboard that might improve things as we march through these topics and issues. The thing was just too floppy, hard to use. In such a small space, just didn't work. Maybe I'll find a way of making it work better later. But right now, I'm going to go ahead without using that whiteboard. Don't think we'll lose too much. It is my expectation that I should be able to do this class in 10 sessions, but it's more or less a guess on my part. I think I can do it in 10 sessions. That ought to be enough. I mean, after all, we only have 2,000 years to cover, so yeah, 200 years per session. That sounds about reasonable. I do want to say that one of the limitations of doing this online is that we don't have the ability to accept questions. That was one of the better parts of our time when we were meeting in the Bible study on Wednesday mornings at Magruder Hospital. It was really very freewheeling and doing an awful lot of open-ended questioning and so forth. We really obviously can't do that when we're online, but if you do have questions, I want to have the opportunity to answer them. And so I would ask you, if you do have questions that are, I would ask, pertinent to the discussion at hand, email them to me, and I'll do my best to answer them during our next session. I think probably the first question that needs to be answered when beginning a class on church history is, why in the world would we want to study church history? The reality is, and I know it, that an awful lot of people think that the class they liked least in school was history. I mean, who cares? Who needs it? How is this going to help me later in life? And all those kinds of questions. Not only that, they found history to be boring. Not only that, an awful lot of people find church to be boring. So you put together history and church, and what do you have? You have boring squared. And I hope you're not coming into this with that kind of expectation, because I want you to know that I found church history to be probably the most fascinating subject I studied while studying theology. I found church history to be a grand and a fantastic story full of drama, suspense, all kinds of things. It's also very closely related to world history, and some of the very most interesting aspects of world history are also very interrelated with the church and church history. And so you pull all that together and you've got, as I said, I find it to be a very fascinating and interesting subject. Still, there are the questions of why we ought to be studying this. I think the first reason to study it is that people really don't know very much about church history. And that's understandable. It's because guys like me don't really normally spend a whole lot of time talking about church history, maybe in passing here and there, and we mention something that happened and almost act like people ought to know about it, but they really don't. But a better reason for studying church history, which is certainly related to the first one, is that church history actually does inform us as to who we are as a church. It tells us how we got here. It even explains how we came to believe the things that we believe. It actually does tell us who we are. So what comes out of church, study of church history? We really have understanding, a greater level of understanding than we had perhaps before undertaking this study of church history. And I certainly do hope that that is what's going to happen during this class. So let's really get started at it. Let's start at the very beginning, because that is, of course, a very good place to start. However, if we decide to start at the beginning, just where is the beginning? Well, church history is Christian history, so maybe it all begins with Jesus. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that Jesus came out of Judaism. Jesus was Jewish. His background was and is Judaism. So maybe if we're going to understand church history, we need to begin with the history of Israel. Maybe we need to go all the way back to Abraham and Sarah and look at their family and the history of their family, the history of Israel itself. But if we do that, we're suddenly going from 2,000 years of history to almost 4,000 years of history. That's the time span that we're talking about when we're talking about all of our history as Christian people. Well, we're not going to go back all that far. We've got our hands full just covering 2,000 years. And so we are going to start with Jesus. What do we know about Jesus? We think we know a lot, but do we know a lot about Jesus? We don't even know the exact date of his birth. Theologians who've studied this have estimated that Jesus was born sometime between 6 BC and 4 AD, which is kind of a surprising thing. I mean, BC is before Christ, and so Jesus was born 6 years before Christ. That's kind of weird, but it's, it would be hard to identify him as being born in the year 0. And scholars have said that the best estimate they can come up with is sometime in that time frame between 6 BC and 4 AD, a 10-year period. There's also the matter of, if we don't know the day of his birth, do we know the day of his death? And in fact, once again, we really don't. I'm going to spend just a minute now, I'm going to read you a rather long paragraph just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that scholars go through and try to figure out such things as what is the date of Jesus' death. So let me take a moment and just read this. 5 methods have been used to estimate the date of the crucifixion of Jesus. One uses non-Christian sources such as Josephus and Tacitus, 2 people we're going to talk about a little bit later this morning or this afternoon. So one of them uses those non-Christian sources. Another works backward from the historically well-established trial of the Apostle Paul by the Roman proconsul Gallio in Corinth in AD 51-52 to estimate the date of Paul's conversion, and working back a bit from that to estimate the date of Jesus' death. And those scholars generally agree that Jesus was crucified between AD 30 and AD 36, not narrowing it down very much. Then there is Isaac Newton's astronomical method, which calculates those ancient Passovers, which are always defined by a full moon, which are preceded by a Friday, as predicted by all four Gospels. And this leaves two potential crucifixion dates, the 7th of April in AD 30 and the 3rd of April in AD 33. Now, in the lunar eclipse model, the Apostle Peter's statement that the moon turned to blood at the crucifixion of Jesus is taken to refer to the lunar eclipse of the 3rd of April in AD 33. Although astronomers are discussing whether the eclipse was visible as far west as Jerusalem, which might call into question that understanding of the date of Jesus' death, recent astronomical research uses the contrast between the synoptic date of Jesus' last Passover on the one hand with John's date of the subsequent Jewish Passover on the other hand to propose Jesus' Last Supper to have been on Wednesday, April 1st, AD 33, meaning this would be the anniversary of that date, today being April 1st. And also then, therefore, if that were the case, then the crucifixion would be on Friday, April the 3rd of AD 33, with the resurrection 2 days later. We often say that Jesus was raised on the third day, but let's face it, he was crucified on Friday afternoon, he died apparently, and then he was raised on Sunday morning early. That's not 3 days, that's more like 36 hours. Nevertheless, doesn't matter very much. The Hebrew way of counting days was Friday would be the first day, Saturday would be the second day, and Sunday would be the third day. Therefore, the third day, 3 days. Anyway, to clear up a little bit there, if there actually was ever any question in your mind about that. Okay, something else that needs to be said. I've used the terms, of course, as we all have most of our lives, BC and AD. Before Christ, and then the Latin phrase Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord, meaning after the birth of Jesus. Scholars these days, Christian scholars as well as others, have pretty much moved away from using BC and AD simply because it doesn't seem right to people of all persuasions and faiths to measure everything by the birth of the Christian God. And so the terms that are currently being used are that instead of AD, we're using Common Era, CE, and before the Common Era began was BCE, before Common Era, and CE, Common Era. I only talk about that in case there's any confusion if you're reading and come across those terms and wonder what they mean. Okay, as I said earlier, we think we know an awful lot about Jesus, but do we actually know a lot about Jesus? Well, we think we do because we have what we consider to be 4 biographies of Jesus, which are the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, tradition tells us that they were written by disciples or close associates of, if not disciples, then apostles, and I'll get into that in just a minute. As a matter of fact, even of those 4, let's see, Matthew and John were disciples. Mark was a close associate of Peter, and Luke was considered to be a close associate of Paul, who was not a disciple but was considered to be an apostle. However, we don't know for sure who wrote any of those Gospels, and so to say that they were in fact written by disciples or close associates of disciples or apostles is a bit of a guess. One of the reasons we're not sure about that, about who the authors were, is because, first of all, none of them identify themselves in the writings as who the author is. And secondly, the dates of the writing scholars consider to be significantly later than you might expect these eyewitnesses to have written. If they saw the events, maybe rush home, started writing down, guess what happened? Well, it didn't happen that way. As a matter of fact, the first of the Gospels to be written, scholars generally agree, was the Gospel of Mark, which was probably written somewhere around 55 AD, or CE if you prefer, which would mean that that's about a whole generation after the death and resurrection of Jesus. The other Gospels were written even later. Matthew and Luke were probably written in the 60s and the 70s, and then the Gospel of John probably not until around 95. Now, does that mean that they could not have been those eyewitnesses or those close associates? Well, of course not. Doesn't mean they would have been getting quite old. But there's another factor involved in all of this, I used the term a little bit ago, the synoptics. And the synoptics refer to the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they're called synoptics because the word essentially means they're similar. They cover much of the same material. In fact, they even tell the stories in much the same way. A very large proportion of the Gospel of Mark is recorded in the Gospels of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, indicating that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, the writers used the Gospel of Mark as source material, along with other source material which are theorized. We don't have those documents in our possession, but by the way words are used and the way stories are told, it's clear that they were using a common source. So if eyewitnesses were writing their own account, then why would they tell things in such the same way, and why would they even bother using, in fact, the same words to go about telling those same stories? What we do know about the Gospels is that they do tell us the story of Jesus, and they are our primary sources for knowledge about the life and the ministry of Jesus. Now, they are not the only stories about the life of Jesus. There are, in fact, a number of other Gospels. One that was discovered not terribly long ago, I think it was about 1945, the Gospel of Thomas. And scholars believe that this just might be an authentic gospel, written at about the same time the other Gospels were written. It's different than the other Gospels in that primarily it contains sayings of Jesus, only sayings of Jesus, a collection of them, and some of them are new to us. Well, does that mean that we should pay attention to them, or should we not pay attention to them? Well, we're probably never going to give the Gospel of Thomas or any other gospel the same credence or authority that we have given the four Gospels. But it doesn't mean it's bad literature. It doesn't mean we can't learn something from it. In fact, we can probably learn something from the other Gospels that I'm not going to bother naming here. But they were written somewhat later, and there are some dubious stories in there. At least they seem dubious to us. Like Jesus playing with the boy Jesus, playing with other boys and getting mad at them and slaying them. Or Jesus playing with some clay and making a bird and it flies away. Okay, we've got a lot of stories that to a lot of people sound unbelievable. Those sound unbelievable to us. Should we accept them? Well, I'm not going to, but I suppose there's no reason not to if you so choose. Now, nevertheless, there are, as I said, many other Gospels or early writings about Jesus. As a matter of fact, very interestingly, the way the Gospel of Luke begins is by saying this. He says, this is the opening of the Gospel of Luke, "Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the Lord, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed." Luke says, look, a lot of people have been writing this down, probably not as well as I'm going to do it, because I went out there and I did thorough research. He sounds like a modern historian. So he says he's going to put together an orderly account, but while doing it, uses a whole lot of the Gospel of Mark and that other source that I was talking about. It's called Q, from the German word Quelle, which means source. But again, that doesn't seem to exist anywhere that anybody has found. Okay, so lots of writing about Jesus. The church decided that these four, and I say the church, over time, took a little while, not a lot of time, the church decided to give special credence to these four. They tell the story of Jesus. This is what we're going to accept, and we do, as we always have. Now, interestingly, there are no contemporaneous accounts from the life of Jesus or mentions of Jesus from that time by others who were writing in that time, and there were others. It's not fair of us to think that our Gospels are the only ancient literature out there. There's lots of ancient literature. Nobody mentioned Jesus from that time. And I don't mean the time of the writing of the Gospels, even though that may very well be true. The church seems to be the only ones interested enough to write. But when you think about it, the Gospels, the way the story is told of Jesus, is really a rock star. And he was wandering up and down Palestine, gathering great crowds who were amazed at everything he did. He was doing all these miraculous wonders. And then the Gospel of Matthew tells us, on the day of his crucifixion, the graves opened up and the dead were walking the streets. And I don't know, doesn't it seem kind of strange that nobody thought to write any of that down? But the reality is they didn't. Now, there was one Jewish historian, a man named Josephus, who I mentioned a little bit ago and said you'd hear from him again. Josephus was actually a Jewish general, and he wrote a history of the Jewish people in about 100 AD, and he wrote something about Jesus, mentioned him and what happened to him and so forth. And so we have that mention. However, since everything is a lot more confounded and confused than it seems like it ought to be, there are scholars who say that passage of Josephus just looks an awful lot like a forgery, that maybe some Christians decided to insert something into Josephus just to give Jesus' story a bit more credence. I don't know about that. Just wanted to let you know some of the things that people talk about. Well, the point is, some 2,000 years ago, there was a man named Jesus of Nazareth. He lived, he died, and then his followers said something incredible happened. He came back. It was amazing. And they were changed and they were moved. And so the question arises, then what happened? And that's what this course is really about. What happened then? Because the answer is a lot happened. We do have one book of the history of the early church in the Bible, and that is the book of Acts. And it actually, its complete title is the Acts of the Apostles. Mostly, though, it's the story of the Acts of Peter and Paul. The book of Acts begins to tell the story about the spread of the church. And it actually begins on the very day of Pentecost. Now, I think we all know that the day of Pentecost is something we celebrate every year as a day when we celebrate the coming of the Holy Spirit, which entered the church and gave it special power to spread the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The book of Acts tells us that on the day of Pentecost, the disciples were all gathered, the Spirit fell upon them, and they were given great power. Now, I do need to mention at this point that the day of Pentecost was not originally, nor is it still originally, a Christian holiday. It is, and was then, a Jewish holiday. It is a celebration of 50 days, Penta, 50 days after the Passover. And so in this celebration of the Passover, Jews from all over the Roman and Greek world came to Jerusalem for the celebration of Pentecost. And the book of Acts names off all the different places where they were from, and it mentions that there were also among that crowd visitors from Rome. Okay, well then, the Spirit came upon the church. The apostles, and very notably Peter, he is definitely recorded as how he responded to the gift of the Spirit, went out and began to preach to those crowds in Jerusalem. And what happened was that those apostles were given the power to speak in languages that they had never studied and learned. They were given that power so that people could hear the gospel of Jesus, in their own language. And they did. And they took those stories, we presume, back home with them. Now, the book of Acts tells us this was an amazing occurrence, and the spread of the church was dynamic at that point. It says there were 3,000 converted in that single day. Well, anyway, we presume then that they took those stories of Jesus back to their hometowns, and maybe at least they laid the groundwork for what was to come a bit later. What came later was missionary activity. Jesus had told those early Christians, you are to go into all the world and preach the gospel, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So they were given that task to go out and preach the gospel to all nations. And eventually they did. We don't have a lot of information about what those first disciples did. There is some talk or at least legends about Thomas going off to India and preaching the gospel. As a matter of fact, there is a community in India to this day, a Christian community that traces their heritage, their lineage, all the way back to the preaching of the apostle disciple Thomas. Same Thomas, by the way, who left the gospel that was recently found, and just to make that little tie. Anyway, primarily what we read in the book of Acts is the missionary journeys of the apostle Paul throughout the Greek world. Apostle Paul, of course, was a Jew, a very fervent Jew, did his best to stamp out the new gospel of Jesus, but was converted on the road to Damascus by a personal appearance by Jesus. And then his life was changed, and he became what many people actually assume to be the founder of what we know of as the Christian religion. So Paul finally reached the point where he went around the Greek and Roman world, and he visited cities, usually beginning by preaching in the synagogues. And there, beginning in the synagogues, he did gain converts, and he moved out from the synagogues. He became pretty unwelcome in the synagogues pretty soon. But he did gain converts, and he founded churches in those cities, and then he moved on to other cities to preach. And after he left, he would write letters back to those churches that he had founded. And in those letters, he would encourage them and teach them and guide them. And those letters that he wrote back, some of them at least, are contained in our Bible, and they are known as the epistles of Paul. Epistle to Paul to the Corinthians, the Epistle of Paul to the Philippians, to the Ephesians, and so forth and so on. And now to talk about the city of Rome. It's going to occupy our time, in one sense, for a long time, because the city in Rome, the church that was headquartered in Rome, became the focus of much of Christian history and of church life. And let's face it, it still is. We Protestants do our best to ignore the reality of that, but the Catholic Church is, after all, the Roman Catholic Church. This church history stuff is still with us in a living and a vital and a real way. And I don't just mean through the Catholics. That's our history too. Now, we don't know who founded the church in Rome. Maybe it was those visitors from Rome that were in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. Maybe it was an apostle or an early evangelist other than Paul. Paul did not found the church in Rome, but Paul, who happened to be a citizen of the Roman Empire, unlike all the others whose names we know, and as a citizen, no doubt he had some degree of pride about being a citizen, and he wanted to visit Rome, and he also wanted to be able to fellowship with the church that was there in Rome. So he wrote an epistle to the church in Rome, even though he had not been the founder of the church in Rome. And the letter that he wrote to them, which is known as the Epistle to the Romans in our New Testaments, he explained his personal beliefs. He told them of what God had instructed him, and the things that were true about Jesus, and so forth. And what he ended up writing in that book of Romans has been called the greatest theological document of all time. And it's that because it is foundational for what the church came to believe and accept as orthodox doctrine. We believe much of what we believe, vast amounts of what we believe, because of the Apostle Paul and largely from what he wrote in the book of Romans. Anyway, to move on to what else was going on in the city of Rome during this time. Rome at this time was, the Roman emperor was a gentleman named Nero. And I really don't think it's unfair to say that Nero was a madman. That's not to say everything he did was crazy, but it seems to us as we read his story that much of it was. And during those days of Nero in the AD 60s, the Christians were a society apart. They were Romans, but they were different. And because they were different, you might say that they were hated, even though the reasons might not seem clear. As a matter of fact, there is a quote that was written actually a few years after the 60s but it tells us something about the way the Christians were conducting themselves in those times. Speaking about the Christian, this writer says, they marry like all other men, and they beget children, but they do not cast away their offspring. That sounds kind of weird, but there actually was a habit at the time. I don't know exactly how widespread it was, but if children were not perfect, or if they were unwanted, or whatever the case was, they were often taken out into the rural areas, the woods outside of town, and simply left to die. Well, this writer's saying Christians don't do that. They have their meals in common, but not their wives. They obey the established laws, and they surpass the laws in their own lives. They love all men, and they are persecuted by all. They are reviled, and they bless. They are insulted, and they respect. Doing good, they are punished as evildoers. Being punished, they rejoice as if they were thereby quickened by life. Christians, when punished, increase more and more daily. Really quite amazing. Well, that's who Christians were, but it does say in there that they were hated, and you might wonder why in the world they were hated. They were hated because they were accused of some terrible things, like infanticide and cannibalism. How in the world were Christians accused of such things as that? Well, one is there was the practice of infant baptism. So they lowered those babies into the water. And when rumors started, they were actually drowning those babies. They were killing those babies. Infanticide. And cannibalism. How could they be accused of cannibalism? Because when they would talk to their friends, and their friend says, by the way, what is it you Christians do when you get together? And what they said was, well, we drink the blood and eat the flesh of our Lord. You do what? Oh, these Christians are cannibals. So they may have been Romans, but they were also the other. And humans have proven many times the tendency to hate the other, those who are different from them, those who are different from the majority. I don't know. Let's get those things out of there. I have my faithful assistant here, Jill. Certainly couldn't do without her, now or ever. Nevertheless, thank you, Jill. I think that helped. Anyway, Christians were the others, persecuted as others often are. Okay. I hope you enjoyed that. We're not finished yet. In AD 64, something terrible happened. Rome burned. Now, the story that's come down was that Nero was entertained by the burning. Matter of fact, you all probably know the story that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. I don't really think that story was true from everything I've been able to read. Most people, I think historians, don't think he actually fiddled, but on the other hand, he probably did enjoy the burning. I've heard that Rome itself was a city of wooden shacks and rubble, and Nero wanted to clear out all of that junk, and he wanted to replace the city with shining marble and to rename it Neropolis. So, the rumor was he set it on fire. Whether or not that's true, he was blamed for the burning, and a scapegoat was needed. Time to focus on the other, and this time the other was the Christians. Well, this is an account written by the Roman historian Tacitus. I said you'd hear about him later. Here it is. Wrote a book a few years after the event. He was actually a young boy living in Rome during the time of the persecutions. And he wrote, therefore, to stop the rumor that he had set Rome on fire, he, Emperor Nero, falsely charged with guilt and falsely charged with guilt and punished with the most fearful tortures the persons commonly called Christians, who were generally hated for their enormities. Christus, founder of that name, was put to death as a criminal by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea, in the reign of Tiberius. But the pernicious superstition, repressed for a time, broke out yet again, not only through Judea, where the mischief originated, through the city of Rome also, whither all things horrible and disgraceful flow. More quality issues that'll hopefully be fixed. Anyway, accordingly, first those were arrested who confessed they were Christians. Next, on their information, a vast multitude were convicted, not so much on the charge of burning the city as of hating the human race. Christians were persecuted. There were horrible tortures. Some of them were wrapped in the skins of wild animals and dogs were turned loose on them. Others were wrapped in skins and hides and dipped in tar and set afire to provide light for Nero's garden parties. And many were executed, including the apostles Peter and Paul. And if you have been to Rome and you have stood in Vatican Square, you were probably standing on the very ground where those executions happened. I want to tell you one more thing before we wrap this one up. The traditions have been that the Basilica of St. Peter was built in such a way so that the altar was above the grave of St. Peter. Well, okay, a good tradition. Was it true? Who knows? Or at least who knew? The St. Peter's that is standing there today is about, well, I guess it's pretty close to 500 years old. Maybe it is a full 500 years old. But there actually was another St. Peter's that stood there for 1,000 years before that. All right there on Vatican Hill. All right there on what was understood to be a Christian cemetery. But there again, after 2,000 years, you can wonder whether or not there's any truth to the legends. So in the 1930s, excavations began under the Basilica of St. Peter. And what they discovered under there was a necropolis, or they call a city of the dead, a cemetery. And during those excavations, they found a grave, an ancient grave, that actually had the words written on it, "Here lies Peter." And of course, they didn't stop their excavations at that point. They went on to excavate that grave, and they did find some ancient bones in that grave. Now, when I was Jill and I were in Rome, it's been almost 2 years now, but when we were there, I learned about this place. It's called the Vatican Scavi, and it is open for tours, but they only take a few people in at a time, and it's hard to get tickets. And I did my best to get my tickets online and consistently failed. They just didn't seem to be at all available in any way I could make it work. So we got to the Vatican, and I got permission to go past the gates, and I found the office of the Vatican Scavi, and I went in and I begged and pleaded that if there had been any cancellations that I might be able to get a ticket, and the answer was no. So I have not been in the Vatican Scavi. But it's almost worth, to me, a trip back to Rome just to get into the Vatican Scavi. That place sounds fascinating to me, and what are understood to be the bones of St. Peter are on display. And just in the event they might be, I want to be there. I want to see them. I think it's at least fascinating history and worth exploring a bit further. Well, that's as far as we're going to go today. So I thank you very much for joining us. If you do have any questions, email them to me. I'll do my best to answer them the next time when we get together. And hopefully that'll be next Wednesday. I'll record another one of these things. So again, thank you very much. You've been a delightful audience. Thank you.